I'm Luke Russell from the Discipline of Philosophy at the University of Sydney. What counts as a life well lived? How should we treat each other? How should we respond when things go wrong? Which goals should we pursue? What counts as human flourishing? For thousands of years, philosophers have been thinking and arguing about these issues. In this series of podcasts, The Philosophy of Living Well, I'll be interviewing some philosophers and asking them what philosophy has to teach us about how we ought to live. In this episode of The Philosophy of Living Well, I'm joined by Matthew Hammerton, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Singapore Management University. And the topic that we're going to be discussing this week is, should we live to work or work to live? So we're going to be asking questions about the relationship between work, on the one hand, and living a happy or a meaningful life on the other. We're going to be talking about workism. We're going to ask, is workism a good way to structure your life? So Matthew, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Great to be here.
So I'm going to begin by asking you some questions about what work is. Many people would think of work as paid employment. So your work is your job. And we're familiar with lots of jobs. You might be a teacher or a lawyer or a hairdresser or a builder or a shopkeeper. And in all of these cases, you're being paid to do something or you're generating income by doing something. So is work simply paid employment?
No, so work is going to be broader than simply paid employment. So first of all, work might not be employment at all. You might be a family farmer. You run a farm with your family. No one's employing you. You don't have a position or a title. And secondly, work may be unpaid. Enslaved people who are working are not being paid, but we're not going to deny that what they're doing is work. An artist may produce a piece of art. They may work hard on it, but it may never sell. So they never get paid for that art they produced. And finally, there's volunteer work, which I think we should count as work. And to really push this idea, imagine a doctor who's agreed to work in a rural area for 3 months to help with healthcare, and they're getting paid. But then the final month, the agency runs out of money and can't pay the doctor. But the doctor says, well, I'll keep doing the same work I've been doing for free. We're not going to say the doctor has stopped working for that last month simply because they're not being paid. They're doing exactly the same as what they were doing before. So work does not need to be paid.
Okay, so some work is unpaid. That leaves us with a bit of a philosophical puzzle. What is work? Have you got an answer to that question?
Yeah, so this is quite a difficult question. I think there's a lot of agreement that work has something to do with producing goods. And I mean goods in a very broad sense, not just material goods, but it can be experiential goods, a state of mind. I say that work is any activity aimed at producing goods of external value. So let me just explain some of those things. So external value, what I mean by that is value beyond the self. So I'm cutting my nails, I'm aiming to produce something of value, but simply for myself. But work is about producing something of external value, of value to others. Even if I consume it ultimately myself, my aim or the aim would be to produce something of general value. But the second thing I want to say here is that when we talk about the activity being aimed at producing these goods, what we mean is its social meaning. So the individual doing the work may not actually have this aim. There may be a cynical store clerk that doesn't care if they produce anything of value. They're just there for the paycheck. But if we think about the social meaning of that kind of role in society and ask, well, what's the point of this role? What's the point of having these kinds of positions? The answer to that question is going to be, well, the point is to produce goods of external value. And that's how I think we can correctly classify our work and non-work cases.
Okay, so your definition of work is something connected to creating goods of external value or being in a social role where you're somehow expected to create goods of external value. How's your definition going to interact with a case of what David Graeber calls a bullshit job? So some of our listeners might be familiar with this category. Some examples of bullshit jobs are jobs in which you're merely ticking boxes but you're not adding anything of genuine value. A job where you're just paid to turn up and make someone else look important, but you're not really contributing anything. Is that work on your definition?
If you think about someone doing a bullshit job, think about the box ticker that's just filling out these pointless compliance forms that no one will ever read. And think about how they might describe what they're doing. They might call it work or not work. So I could imagine this person saying, I don't actually do any work. I just pointlessly shuffle papers. And that makes sense. But on the other hand, I could also imagine them saying, the work I do is a waste of time. It doesn't produce anything of value. So you see, it seems like it could or could not be work, and both seem acceptable ways to describe what they're doing.
Okay, so there's a difference between work and paid employment, even though lots of examples of work are also examples of paid employment. Sometimes people work in an unpaid capacity. What I want to move to now is the question of the relationship between work and meaning in life. There might be stages in your life at which you ask yourself, is what I'm doing meaningful? Particularly if you're in a state of crisis or if you're facing a big strategic decision, like a choice of a career or something like that. Questions about whether that life would be meaningful or whether the life that you're living right now is meaningful are really important and familiar questions. If we ask people what gives your life meaning, some people will say religion. Many of us will appeal instead or maybe in addition to personal relationships, particularly loving relationships in our lives. So what gives your life meaning? You might start talking about your family. Those explanations of meaning strike most of us as being not just normal, but justified. In contrast to loving relationships, appeals to work as a source of meaning are pretty contentious. And sometimes people will criticize others for finding too much meaning in work rather than in other areas of their life. So you might have heard it said, people on their deathbed are never going to say, oh, I wish I spent more time in the office. This is one manifestation of that thought, that putting too much stock in work as a source of meaning in life is a mistake. And the label workism has recently been invented to express something like that idea. So Matthew, you've been writing about this recently. Can you explain to us what is workism? What's the relationship between being a workist and being a workaholic? And what's the alternative to workism?
So workism is the phenomena of people making their work the primary source of meaning and identity in their lives. The term was coined in 2019 by the Atlantic journalist Derek Thompson. He argued that for most of human history, people have either seen their work as a necessary toil or as one of several sources of meaning and identity in their life, alongside things like religion, hobbies, and family. And Thompson argues that this has recently been changing. There's less and less community engagement. People are less and less doing hobbies. And many young people are delaying having a family or not having a family at all. And so people are focusing their lives on their work and getting most of their meaning and identity from this. And Thompson and others think that this is a bad thing. They think that this has various bad consequences. Now, we should be a little bit clearer on exactly what workism is. And it's very helpful here to contrast it with workaholism. So workaholism is a term that's been around since the 1960s. It's meant to be analogous to alcoholism, and it's generally defined in the social sciences as a compulsion to work excessively long hours. Workism, on the other hand, is about what you get your identity and meaning from. Now, you could get most of your identity and meaning from your work, and yet you could not be a workaholic. You might decide that you can be more efficient and productive at work if you stick to 7 hours only, then get adequate rest, and then go back. So you're not working excessively long hours. On the flip side, you could be a workaholic without being a workist. Maybe you find your work meaningless. Maybe your family is everything for you, but you work to support your family and you're very paranoid about losing your job and your family being in financial difficulty. So you work in a compulsive way, excessively long hours. You're a workaholic without being a workist. Having said that, they do seem connected. If you find your work your main source of meaning and identity, you probably are more likely to work longer hours, work harder and longer. However, even then, it's not clear that this would be workaholism because the definition says it's compulsive and it's excessive to work those long hours. But if your work is a huge source of meaning and you're contributing to the world through it, is it really excessive to, say, work a bit longer than usual? It's going to be up for debate.
Let's try and understand why some people are critical of workism. Some of the critics of workism suggest that workism's bad because it's a kind of hyper-focused life, and that means it's an unbalanced life. Now, as philosophers, we're familiar with this thought that a good life should be a balanced life. But as philosophers, we ought to ask questions about that. Is that a useful metaphor here, the idea of balance in a life? Is it really the case that the best kind of life is a life in which different goods and different activities are balanced? Or can a hyper-focused life be equally good?
Yeah, I think we need to be very careful here. Unbalanced is a pejorative term. It tends to just smuggle in certain assumptions here. But when we look at philosophical theories of what the good life is, we see that there's various answers here. For example, one popular theory with a long lineage is hedonism. Hedonism says that your life goes better for you the more you experience pleasure and the less you experience pain. Now, if that's the case, then there would be nothing wrong with living an imbalanced life as long as that life gives you more pleasure and less pain. If focusing on one narrow thing is more pleasurable for me, that would be the better life for me, according to the hedonist. So to really get this objection working, we need the right kind of foundational theory of human value. And the place to look for this theory is Aristotelian perfectionism. Aristotelian perfectionists argue that to live a flourishing life, we need to develop the various properties that are essential to our human nature. So these basic goods would be things like having friendships and loving relationships, having knowledge and understanding of our world and our place in it, being physically healthy, developing moral virtue, right? Being good people who make a positive contribution to the world. And the Aristotelian perfectionist says the good life consists of all these things, regardless of whether they give us maximum pleasure. Furthermore, many Aristotelian perfectionists have said it's essential that we develop all aspects of our human nature. We want a good balance of these basic perfectionist goods. We don't want to pursue one good, get a lot of total good from that, but have insignificant amounts of the other goods. An Aristotelian perfectionist would tend to prefer a well-balanced life with a little less good overall than a very narrowly focused life that has more total good. So if you accept this view, and look, it's controversial, many philosophers will reject it, but if you accept this view, this could give some philosophical basis to the objection that workism is wrong because it's an imbalanced life.
Perfectionists say that to live a good life, it has to be a balanced life. Do you think it's possible that someone who is a workist, who gets the primary meaning in their life from work, could nonetheless live a balanced life?
Yeah, I think this is one way in which the argument that appeals to balance goes wrong. So when you look at what Aristotelian perfectionists are listing as their basic goods, you often don't see work on the list. You often see things like friendship, loving relationships, achievement, knowledge, maybe aesthetic excellence. Now, if you think about it, someone who focuses their life on work may be able to get many of these goods in the workplace. Maybe in the workplace, they have really good friendships with their colleagues. Maybe they work as a team. Maybe in the workplace, they develop their knowledge. Furthermore, note that workism doesn't mean that you only do work. So if you can get many of these perfectionist goods at work, and the ones you can't get at work, you can get through your hobbies or the relationships you engage with outside of work or things like that, then you could potentially live the kind of balanced life an Aristotelian perfectionist wants while focusing a lot of your life on your work.
One of the potential criticisms of workism is that finding meaning primarily through work is perhaps a more risky strategy in your life compared to finding meaning primarily through other sources. People might feel a sense of loss of meaning when they retire. If you're someone who is a workist, who finds meaning and identity in the work that you've done, and suddenly you have no more work to do, how's that going to impact on your perception of your life and how it's going? So do you think there's something to this criticism that finding meaning primarily through work is a risky strategy because work might cease?
Yeah, I do think there's an issue of concern here. But the first thing I'd say is it extends beyond work. It's really an issue about focusing your life on any one domain, as opposed to having a more pluralistic approach to life where all the different life domains play key roles. So if I focus my life on work and work goes wrong, that can lead to a crisis of meaning. But if I focus my life on family or a relationship and that goes wrong, that can lead to a crisis of meaning. So we can think of this as the problem of putting too many eggs in one basket. However, we have to be very careful about what we're comparing. I think when people push this criticism, they often compare a well-rounded life with an extreme cartoonish version of workism, where a person is completely obsessed with work and does very little in their life other than work. Now, if we're comparing that, then yes, workism in that extreme form is going to be very risky. If that was what your life was and you lost your job, then what do you have? You have nothing, right? You have maybe no meaningful relationships you can draw on. You have no hobbies or other interests that you can engage yourself with while you're unemployed. But this form of workism is actually not that common. Humans are social animals. We need engagement with others. And so the more common version of workism that we're going to see is what I would call moderate workism. It's where work is your primary source of meaning and identity, but you still have several other important sources of meaning and identity. You still have important relationships in your life. You still have some interest or causes you care about beyond work. And when we compare moderate workism with a well-rounded life, I think the difference is only a difference of degree. So yeah, the well-rounded life is going to have better resources to draw on because they've invested more in their relationships, they've invested more in their hobbies and things like that. But the moderate workist is still going to have decent resources to draw on if work goes bad for them. And so what we need to do is ask, does this slight disadvantage the moderate workist has strongly count against moderate workism, or are there gains that may be made that could make it worth it? And I think in many cases, there is compensation for the risk that the moderate workist takes on. If making work your primary source of meaning and identity allows you to be very impactful in how you live your life, then you may gain more meaning from that than if you lived a well-rounded life.
So far, we've been looking at criticisms of workism and how people who find meaning in work might defend that choice against those critics. But now you're pointing to something which seems to go beyond that. It's a potential massive payoff to finding meaning through your work. Maybe that meaning that you find in your work is going to be a huge motivator, which gives you the ability to focus and achieve more. And if what you're doing through work really is beneficial to others, workism might be not just good for you, but beneficial for the world.
Yes, that's right. And I think that one interesting thing to consider here is, what do we view as the most meaningful human lives, right? I think, as you mentioned earlier, everyone agrees that relationships are a very important source of meaning, probably a necessary source of meaning that everyone needs in their life. But when we think about the most meaningful human lives, we don't tend to think of people that just had amazing family relationships. That's very valuable, but what we tend to think of is people who, through their work, were able to achieve great things and have a great impact on the world. So paradigm cases of highly meaningful lives would be people like Martin Luther King Jr., or maybe great scientists like Albert Einstein, or great artists like Frida Kahlo, or great humanitarians like Mother Teresa. These are the names that typically come up. And if you think about these people, you could describe them as workers with a noble cause. They were people that focused their life on their work, on their projects of producing goods of external value for others. And in doing so, they are able to have a great impact on the world that you just couldn't have by focusing on personal relationships.
Matthew, you've been defending workism as a reasonable option for many people. But do you think that someone who's not a workist, or indeed someone who doesn't find much meaning in their work at all, is thereby making some kind of mistake? Do you think we ought to find meaning in our work?
No, I don't think there's anything wrong with living a life where you don't get much meaning from your work. For various reasons, people find themselves in circumstances where meaningful work is not readily available to them. And that's okay. There are many sources of meaning in life. And if you're in that position, then you can focus on your family or your hobbies or your community or religion or whatever it is and get that as your main source of meaning and identity. On the other hand, if you can also get meaning from your work, that's great. We have to spend, for most of us, a lot of our time at work. So if that work can become meaningful, that's a very good thing. And that has led some philosophers to actually argue that maybe there's a right to meaningful work. Maybe as society improves, we should be looking to automate the boring, meaningless jobs and make sure that there's enough meaningful work available to everyone.
How does AI fit into all of this? Because a really common fear at the moment is that AI might replace a whole lot of jobs within our lifetime. Is that a realistic possibility? And is it something that we ought to be afraid of, or is that something that we should welcome?
This is a very important question for us to think about. One direction we might take is to think that a post-work world is a great world for humans. It's one where we don't have the toil of work and we can focus on relationships and leisure and self-development. But another way you might view this is you might think a post-work world is one where we're missing one of our key sources of meaning in life. The idea that to produce value for others, to have a positive impact on the world in that kind of way, is a very important part of human lives. It always has been. And in a post-work world, we miss that source of meaning. And that's going to be a bad thing that takes away one of the most important sources of meaning in our lives.
Maybe people who are criticizing workism are actually criticizing something else, like an excessive desire for money or an excessive desire for status. Is that really what's behind criticism of workism?
So I have a term for this. I say, well, this isn't workism. This kind of thing is statusism, getting your meaning and identity primarily from your status. And I want to contrast workism, getting meaning and identity from doing work, which means producing goods of value for others. I want to contrast that with statusism, getting meaning and identity from the status that you have. So I think that a lot of the critics of workism are actually criticizing statusism. They see people increasingly drawing their status from their work, and they see various negative things that go along with that. And I think it is a bad thing, right? So I would even call this fake workism, which is where someone presents themselves as very focused on their work and getting meaning and identity from that. But really what it's about for them is the status they get through work and not the goods that they produce through the work that they do.
Matthew, what are some other examples of people who might be accused of workism, but in fact they're inappropriately focused on status?
So I think influencers are a good example. I'm sure there's some influencers that are genuine workists who really do care about the value they're producing through the content they produce. But we all know that there's many influencers that are just very obsessed with their viewer numbers and their followers and very concerned with the status that that gives them.
Do you think there are some kinds of job, some kinds of work that people do that it's inappropriate to find meaning in? Do you think someone would be making a mistake if they find a lot of meaning in doing a bullshit job or a job that doesn't contribute anything to society?
Yes, I think focusing your life on work carries this risk, but actually focusing your life on anything carries this risk. So the key question here is there actually genuine value in the thing that you perceive as valuable and focus your life on? So is your work actually producing goods of value, or are you deluded about that? But note that this is a more general point about everything. Suppose that I'm in a romantic relationship and I'm drawing a lot of meaning from that, but I don't realize that the person in the relationship with me is actually of bad character. They're narcissistic and they're using me. Maybe they're carrying on several other relationships at the same time. So while in general getting meaning from relationships is a good thing, in that situation it's going to be a bad thing because we're deluded about the value that's actually there in the relationship.
I'm Luke Russell from the Discipline of Philosophy at the University of Sydney, and you've been listening to The Philosophy of Living Well. Our guest in this episode is Matthew Hammerton from Singapore Management University. Thanks for joining us, Matthew.
Thank you.
This podcast series is presented by the Discipline of Philosophy in the School of Humanities at the University of Sydney.